Hello there, it's Julie. I'm just dropping in because I said I'd come into the group to talk about drying flowers. So I've postponed this live a couple of times. I don't know whether you've been seeing the notifications on it, as I had forgotten I had something on this morning. So here we are. And I thought I would talk about drying lavender. So I've got a lovely bunch of lavender in my little pot here. And you dry flowers different ways according to the flowers that you've got. So as the season passes, hello Alison, have you got any questions about drying flowers? I'm going to be using lavender, and the reason I decided to use lavender to show you how to dry flowers was because my sister has a really lovely lavender hedge, a bed, going up to her front door on both sides, and she's got quite a sunken path and you go up to the door, and I knew she was wanting to cut it back because the bees were getting in the way of the postman. So I did ask her whether I could use some of her lavender, and I think she was hoping I was going to cut it back for her. Hello Alison, my hand was going up to say hello. But actually this isn't from her garden, because when I went to go and look at her lavender, I decided that it was too mature. It had too many flowers on it. And that's the thing about drying flowers, is they need to be in absolute tip-top perfect condition. So instead of it being a sort of afterthought, you're thinking, well, these flowers haven't lasted so well in my vase, I might as well try and dry them. You want to use absolutely top quality materials. So her lavender was just too mature. It had beautiful, beautiful flower heads. But as soon as you start to try and dry that, the flower, because it continues to mature a little bit, the flower petals would have fallen off, and the whole the flower structure would just have broken apart and shattered really on the table. So what you need to do is, if you're using lavender, and the same applies to other kinds of flowers as well that you might want to dry, is to get them in that state there. So I don't know if you can see that, but it's only got the tiniest bit of colour from the flower showing. So you want to harvest your materials, your lavender, when it's just coming up to the peak perfection, but not when it's actually got flowers on it. And it's the same for helichrysums. You quite often find they're quite, I think they're actually called straw flowers. Their little flowers are quite paper in texture. But again, you want to use those when they are still in bud, but they're just hinting of them opening up. And if you do try and dry those ones there when they've opened up, they just shatter and fall apart. So you're wanting to pick your materials when they're in absolute peak condition, which if you were naturally looking at them in the garden, you think was slightly underripe. So that's my first tip for you. The next tip is you need to prepare your flowers. Now, these bits of lavender have come straight from my garden, and as with lots of other cut flowers, you'll find that they've got bits of greenery on the side. So the first thing to do is to take all that off, because it's the flower head that you're drying, and you don't want these shriveled bits of greenery. And you can see here that they're still tight here, although this bud is slightly more mature. Now I've cheated a little bit really, because I couldn't use my sister's lavender. I've bought my lavender in town a few days ago, and I'm quite lucky that I live in a small market town. There's always something interesting for sale. There were cherries this week, and quite often the local charity shops, if they've got their volunteers have a surplus of produce, you quite often find apples and pears for sale there. And lo and behold, you'd asked me to do a section on dried flowers, and I actually bought this lavender, and it had all been beautifully packaged up with a little lavender coloured bow and put into a plastic sheath. Now I took that off as soon as I got the flowers home, because the flowers are starting to sweat, which isn't very good, and they would have rotted off if I'd left them in the bag. And you can see that whoever put these bundles together has done the job for me. They've taken off all these little bits of greenery on here, and then they've bundled the flowers together so that they are a consistent length, just for ease really. There's no need to do that. And they have got rid of most of the bits of green shoots. Hello Caroline, how are you? Hi. So I'm talking lavender, and I was going to take my lavender over for my sister's hedge, her front path, because it was getting in the way of the postman. But her lavender had matured too much and it was too far gone. I mean, it looks beautiful, but when you're drying lavender and other flowers, you need to have them or pick them when they are in peak condition, which means actually, although it's highly scented, you can't actually see the flowers. So the lovely lavender coloured flowers, the fleshy bit of the flower hasn't come out yet. And what I've done here is I've cut them. Well, I would have cut them, but somebody else has cut them for me, and take off the bits of greenery. And then I use an elastic band to bundle my flowers together. And the reason I'm doing that is because as the flowers dry out, the stems contract. They're not taking up water anymore. They're not soft and juicy. They are drying out. So the stems will shrink in volume, and I find it easiest to control what we're doing by using an elastic band, because as your flowers dry over time, it's quite possible that you'll need to give them another run round with the elastic band. And if you were just to tie them up with a pretty piece of string or a decorative piece of ribbon, you may well find that as they dry out, the bundle starts to fall apart because the fixing works loose, because the flowers are drying and shrinking, their stems are shrinking. And I'm holding the flowers this way up because this is the way up that you need to hang your flowers to get them to dry. If you were to dry them in, you just thought, oh, it's a pretty bundle, I'll keep it in the vase. Well, what you've got then is you've got a bunch of flowers in a container that aren't taking up water, so they're going to droop. And it would just mean, instead of having these nice long stems, it would dry, but you'd have stems probably that were falling down like this. And depending on what you wanted to use your dried flowers for, you may decide that you just don't want your flowers to dry in an arched or a droop direction. So that's why you see flowers, when they're being dried, being hung upside down, because gravity will just keep your stems straighter. And I've subdivided my bundle into a smaller piece because you want the air to circulate around a little bit. So again, that it dries off and it isn't actually, the moisture of the plant isn't there getting trapped inside, because you may find if your bundle is too big that you get a bit of mould developing and then the flowers are dying rather than drying off. And then with that elastic band, I would then hang it up somewhere. So you want somewhere that's darkish. If you hang them up and dry them in direct sunlight, you'll just have the flowers will fade over time. And part of the reason for drying it is you want to preserve the flower, but also the lovely colour intensity. You want to keep that going. And as I say, that does have a lovely scent. And you could try hooking this piece of elastic band over a handy picture frame or something like that. I know I've got a hook up there, so I could hang that up there. So it does become a slightly more decorative item whilst it's hanging up. Or you could string across, I'm in my workshop here, if I was going into full-time production with my drying, that I could hang up a string and then peg these into position. So it's just a matter of bundling up reasonably small. That's probably, diameter of a 20p piece, something like that. So quite small bundles. Tightening with the elastic band, and just as the flowers dry out, I'll just need to check them and tie another band, tighten up the band if it needs be. And Caroline, you're asking whether you can dry any type of flowers. On the whole, you can, and like everything with our flower arranging, it's trial and error. So I would say you could dry roses. We're quite used to seeing dried roses. But again, if you were picking them from the garden, you'd need to pick them when they were just sort of at bud stage, beginning to open out. And again, it's that sort of balanced judgment you need to make, because if you're growing roses at home in the garden, that you don't want to be cutting them off before they've come into full bloom. So if you were thinking of drying flowers, I would suggest that you go to the supermarket and they sell the bunches of roses, in 10 or 12 to a bundle, and buy them again, absolutely peak condition. And then when you get them home, slice off the cellophane wrapping, pull off all the, most of the greenery, and do the same thing, bundle them together with the elastic band. And again, probably make 2 bundles out of those roses, because you want the air to circulate around, and then hang them up and wait for them to dry. And you'll find that as the leaves dry, any leaves you leave on, if you are too rough with them, they'll just crumble off. So that's the thing as well, that as the flowers dry, they do become really, really brittle, and they won't withstand being knocked around very much. And of course you could also go to your florist as well, but the florist will tend to sell more prized specimens in terms of their roses, so they'll be very large headed. And I would say that probably if you're spending £2.50, £3 per stem for your rose, you'd want to enjoy it for its natural, fresh beauty, rather than sort of harvesting it as a dried flower. So I would say lavender from the garden would be great. Supermarket roses would be great. You do dry hydrangeas differently. I know we've been talking about hydrangeas the last week or so, and there's a slightly different technique for that, because you do actually let them stand in water and let them slowly dry out. But I will show you that when I've bought some more hydrangeas in the future. And really it's just, as I say, trial and error. The one common thing is these flowers are quite robust to start with, so anything really delicate probably won't dry, and you have to pick it in that peak condition. So it's just when it's on the point of what you consider to be maturity, but it's on the young side of maturity. Once it's sort of gone into full bloom and fully open, you've missed your chance, and it'll just, as it continues through its life cycle, it'll burst open, and then the flower head will shatter, and you'll just end up with a potpourri rather than actually dried flowers on a stem. So I think that's probably all I've got to share with you at the moment. So the tip is elastic bands, so you can retighten it as your flowers dry out and the stems shrink, and hanging it upside down so the flower heads are pulled down by gravity. If you dry them that way up, they're going to just flop over in the vase, because it'll be a vase of flowers without water, and they will dry, but you'll have a bizarre angle on them. So upside down, darker room, doesn't have to be pitch black, but just not in direct sunlight, because you don't want the flowers to fade. And then just give it a go, and it's a matter really of just waiting and giving it a try and error. I'm looking at the questions at the same time. Lavender is really easy to dry, Caroline's asking me. Also, nigella is really good as well. Do you know nigella? It's a straight stem with a small round seed head that's quite often got stripes on it, sort of a green round seed head with a purpley stripe, and lots of sort of filigree leaves, which again I would take all those leaves off and dry that the same way, upside down. Poppy heads dry really easily, and probably if you've got those the large poppy heads, the poppies growing in the garden, sort of self-seed everywhere, that quite often, lavender mist, that's it, nigella, lavender mist, Alison, you're quite right. The poppies will dry in situ almost. Well, they will dry in situ. They go from that lovely green to the brown, but if you leave them too long in the garden, they go from green to brown, and then as the seeds mature, the birds will be after the seeds, so you'll see peck marks in them, so you won't end up with a perfect seed head. So I would say as soon as your poppies, the petals have fallen off and you can see the green seed head ripening, is to bring that indoors. And the same thing, I would take off the green leaves, because they just get really, really brittle and shatter anyway. It makes a bit of a mess. Cut the stems down, because your poppies will be on really long stems. Cut them down to a manageable length, probably 30 or 40 centimetres. Same thing, bundle them together upside down and hang them up where the air can circulate around. Poppies are quite messy to dry, because as they do dry, the tiny little black seeds will fall out of the holes of the seed head. So it may be that if you're drying poppies, that you might want to sort of rig something up where you knew that if you're going to be knocking the seed heads at all, that you'd be able to catch them, and perhaps even cast those out and have another crop of poppies next year. So I would say lavender is really easy, lavender mist is really easy, which is the nigella, and poppies are really easy, and some of the decorative alliums as well, where they've got a really tight head. The fancy alliums, which are in the onion family, some of the alliums are really, really decorative, and they have a drooping head to them. So if you get the sort of tighter heads that just look like a ball of flower, seed head, they dry really well as well. So again, you could with that, I would say even you could wait for the flower to go over and just sort of knock the last of the petals off and dry those. And that one I wouldn't dry upside down, because you'll find with the seed head, the sort of globe ball of it, if you let it turn upside down, it's like hanging your hair upside down when you wash your hair and drying your hair. They'll all sort of flop down. So I would dry that one the right way up. And I just thought of another one, Echinops, the globe artichoke. Do you know that? It's a spiky green leaf with tall stems, and then the head of that is sort of a bluey grey, and that dries really well as well. But again, I would pick it just before the tiny little blue blossoms show. So again, it's that toss-up. If you're cutting your flowers from the garden, it means that you're taking away the natural beauty that appears in your garden before you're ready to enjoy it. So you either need to be growing your flowers to enjoy in the garden and cutting them to bring inside as fresh flowers, or you're thinking, I'm going to have to cut these flowers before they've made their show in the garden, which means you're not going to be able to enjoy them in the garden, and you'll be able to enjoy them at home, but not as cut flowers. You're going to be waiting till they're dry, but that will, in the end, give them a longer season, because with a bit of care, you'll probably get a year's enjoyment out of them, because they eventually, over time, they will get really brittle and just break apart and shatter. But we've talked about that before, that if you're working with your flowers, is to not do any housework. So as long as you're not moving your flowers around, once you've dried your flowers and then displayed them, whether you're doing that in a conventional flower arrangement but using dried flowers, or whether you just like your dried flowers to be in a little vase on the side, they will last for ages, but they will attract dust. So you either need to sort of be blowing it off, or on a hairdryer to a cool setting, just to sort of move the dust away. But really, once I've done that, dried flowers, I just leave them. And because once you start cleaning up too much, they start to fall apart. So Caroline's asking me again that it may be worth buying flowers in to dry. Yes, it will be worth buying flowers in to dry. And just make sure that when you're buying them in, that they are at the condition you want them to be in. So the lavender that I bought in was just in perfect condition, which, as I say, is slightly under mature, and you just need to be quite critical of what you're buying, thinking, what stage is it in its life cycle in terms of maturity. So fresh roses, you'd be fine. Echinops, the thistle we were talking about, I would be hesitant if it's got any showing, or if it's got too much show of the little tiny blossoms. I would say probably it was too far mature for that. Poppies, you can buy poppy seed heads quite widely available when you've got your eye in for where you're buying them from. So they would be fine. In fact, you may actually be buying them when they are the browner colour rather than the fresh green. So yes, it is worth buying things in. And like everything, just give it a go. You can enjoy the flowers. Don't spend loads of money. Just spend what you can afford, and either enjoy them as a fresh cut flower, or experiment and see whether you can get them lasting a bit longer by actually physically trying to dry them. So the tip for drying is peak condition, elastic band the stems together, smaller number of stems so the air's can circulate and you're not going to get anything going mouldy in the middle, and hanging it up so that on the whole nature takes its course in terms of gravity to keep your stems straight, and then dry them in a darker room rather than direct sunlight. So unless I've got any more questions for me, I shall leave it there. And as you can see, I've hung my first bit of lavender up on the hook I've got there. So they can be decorative at the same time while you're trying to get them to dry. And otherwise, if you had a coat hook somewhere in our garage, we've got a couple of coat hooks, and sometimes I divide the stem off and hang them over the coat hook. So, I'm glad you've enjoyed it, Caroline. So, as I say, have a go with your flowers. If you've got lovely gardens at home, take a picture of your flowers and what you've got at home, and we can have a chat about whether it's going to be worthwhile you cutting them to dry them. So I'm more than happy to give you advice. And if you give it a go, send me a couple of photographs and we can see how they get on and how long they take to dry over the summer. So I think that's all for now, and I'll see you another time. So cheerio.